18. There were 3 of them, lurking by a closed door further up the alley. Rodin's weariness was gone in an instant. He could turn around and walk away. But if they were waiting for him, they would follow. He didn't want them at his back. He needed to keep them where he could see them. He walked closer, keeping them in his periphery but otherwise ignoring them. They were not ignoring him. They glanced towards him, then looked away. As they saw Rodin approach, their stance changed. Nothing too obvious, but Rodin could see it. They were preparing. Rodin was walking into a trap. He could already hear movement from behind. His hand automatically moved towards part of his jacket, ready to grab a blade if when the situation demanded it. He kept his head straight but checked out the trio by the door. One was larger, bulkier. He seemed to be the most relaxed. He was chewing something, and he spat as he nudged the skinny one to his left. Wiry would be a better description. Even his features were long and thin, his mouth a crack that crept up his face. His fingers were long too, and as they disappeared into a pocket, Rodin saw them clench round something. They came out as a fist, hiding a blade. The third stepped away from the others, across the alley. She had her hair tied back, pulling her face up. She didn't smile. None of them did. The wiry one would be fast. She would fight dirty. And the bulky one would only join the fight when he had to, but he would make sure every hit counted. Weaknesses, Rodin thought, assessing. The wiry one was sneering already, so he was cocky, maybe too sure of himself. If he were goaded, he was likely to overreach and leave himself vulnerable. Insults would put him off his guard. The woman wouldn't expect an opponent to treat her with the same respect as the others, so she would not be expecting Rodin to hit her with just as much force as he would do anyone else. And if it came to it, that long hair was simply begging to be used to pull her down. And the bulky man. He would be wary, but would possibly over-analyze. He would be the slowest of the 3. And Rodin had noticed a slight limp as he too stepped away from the door. Rodin brought his hand up to his mouth, forcing a cough, his other hand to his chest, bending down slightly. Just enough to glance behind. 2 others, spread out across the entrance to the alley. They were staying back. This gang knew what they were doing. As he recovered from his cough and continued forward, Rodin saw the door open and heard metal hit stone. And Sporif stepped out. Interesting. So he'd figured out who had gone into his room. And he had enough clout or money to hire this gang. He stepped into the middle of the alley and turned to face Rodin, a few steps away. Rodin stopped. Sporif nodded. Rodin returned the greeting. "Can I help?" Rodin decided to keep it friendly. Officially, there was no connection between the 2 of them. Rodin had not been introduced to Sporif. Although Sporif had no doubt seen a picture of Rodin, they had never met face to face.
"Can you help?"
Sporif spoke slowly, turning each word into its own question. He folded his arms, letting Rodin see that he had the situation under control, that he had nothing to fear. Rodin kept his hands by his side. He waited. No sounds from behind. The pair at the alley entrance were waiting back. The trio stood silently, watching from a few steps behind Sporif, ready to step into play the moment Rodin made a threatening move.
"I think we should talk."
Rodin nodded. The man was trying to be unnerving, giving off the vibe that he knew more than Rodin did. Maybe some people would be intimidated by such an act, but Rodin had seen it all before. He'd stood before psychopaths. He'd faced down deranged individuals who would have thought nothing of gutting him on the spot. In comparison, Sporif and his cronies were a walk in the park. They stood tough, but they wanted to come out of this in one piece. They were predictable. And Rodin knew that if he remained silent, Sporif would talk.
"You might think you know me, but it would be wise to not get too comfortable in your supposed knowledge. I might have a few surprises in store if you were to, shall we say, push too far."
Rodin analyzed Sporif's words, the way he spoke. He was not as clear as he probably intended to be. Beneath the calm exterior, the man was nervous. He wanted to appear menacing, but it wasn't working. Sporif took a step closer, and Rodin saw the trio behind shift their weight. But Sporif was not engaging yet. He was still playing at being a threat.
The great Rodin. Master mercenary. Currently contracted to find a certain Ratch.
He smiled.
Oh yes. I know all about you. I know how you work. A great deal of research, then a perfectly executed plan. Unfortunately, your research seems to be leading you into areas where it would be best if you stayed away from.
Rodin was forced to stifle a smile at the confused sentence structure. Aiming for menacing, ending up sounding illiterate. But that didn't mean he was less of a threat. Rodin was still on alert, and knew something was happening. Nothing definite, nothing more than a feeling. A moving body normally made sound, but there were ways of minimizing these sounds. Clothing that was tight, material that did not rub. Soft-soled shoes terrible for many things but ideal for sneaking about. Keeping movements flowing and steady, not necessarily slow, and definitely not hesitant. And of course, concentrating on breathing with the movements. It helped if the intended target was distracted, for instance by garbled threats. Rodin shifted to one side as the club swung down, a glancing blow to his arm. He spun, bringing his foot out, connecting with the lower leg. There was enough force in his kick to push the leg away. It gave him the time to shift further back, time to take in the scene. Both thugs from the alley entrance loomed at him. One with the club short metal and one with a blade. The blade moved towards Rodin, anticipating his movement. He lurched into the arm that held it, bringing his stomach in, knowing it would be close. He brought his elbow back, connecting with the chest. He felt breath pushed out hot on his neck and he brought his fist up hard. Something cracked and a body fell behind him. The other one held his club high, muscles shifting. Rodin stepped forward, keeping low. He brought his arm up, aiming for the thug's neck. He felt the lance pierce skin and pressed the button. He stepped away as the man slumped. The other person was in a crumpled heap, blood spreading from the shattered nose. Rodin noticed this person's chest was still. He turned to face Sporif. Somehow, the gun that was now pointing his way was not a surprise. It suited the man act tough, but unwilling to dirty his hands.
Very good. But I doubt you are faster than a bullet. So let's stop the game, shall we?
Who's playing? Rodin could see the flicker in the man's eyes as he tried to come back with something.
Okay. Let's talk business.
No comeback. Sporif would be annoyed at that. Good.
You are after Ratch, not me. I don't appreciate my private rooms being taken advantage of. And I don't appreciate someone trying to get one over on me.
I don't know what you're talking about. Let's see how far we can push things, Rodin thought. He mentioned games, so let's play.
Don't insult my intelligence. You were in my room and you were looking for something. You broke into my files. Don't deny it.
You have proof? A pause.
That is not for you to know. And proof is not required. I know what you're up to. This is a warning. Stick to your contract.
Maybe it's part of my contract. There was another hesitation. Rodin could imagine the doubts that sentence might plant in Sporif's mind. Did Rodin have another contract additional to the one on Ratch? Was Malice up to something? Or was Rodin bluffing? Rodin pushed a little further. You should never totally trust those you deal with. Everyone has their own agenda. Slowly Sporif shook his head.
You're trying to make out Malice is double-crossing me? The thought is laughable. I don't know how much you found out so far, but we go back a long way. We're like blood.
That word ricocheted around Rodin's mind, searching for a mate. Like blood? No, more like master and servant. He calls the shots and you're the handyman who does all the work. That's how it works, isn't it? And another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Blood and handyman. The names that appeared on Ratch's list but not Sporif's. Two clients who would not be receiving a visit from a mercenary. At least not one hired by the old man. Sporif's face showed concern, then he took a step back.
You don't know what you're talking about.
He raised the gun, a slight tremor in his hand. And you don't know who you're dealing with. Rodin took a step forward, wary of the finger that even now reached further round the trigger. The slightest of jerks and it could all be over.
Do your job. Take your pay. Then get the hell away from us.
Rodin raised an eyebrow. Sporif brought his other hand up, steadying the gun. Rodin wondered if Sporif had ever fired it before. He wondered if it was even loaded. Assume the worst. Assume it was loaded. Even if Sporif had never fired in the heat of a situation, assume he had trained. And assume that the 3 remaining thugs held similar weapons. Rodin moved no closer. Instead, he allowed his shoulders to sag slightly. You say you know how I work. So you know I don't remove non-targets unless it is vital. He glanced down at the 2 fallen thugs. At least one of these 2 are still alive. The other, I don't think, was so lucky. But they brought it on themselves. I did what I had to. I see no need to harm you or your friends, and here Rodin gave a nod to the bulky man. There was the briefest of nods in return. If you order them to attack and they choose to do so, I will defend myself. If you choose to try to use that gun, I will do all I can to stop you. But as things stand, I am willing to walk on my way without making things any worse than they already are. Rodin knew it was a bold move, especially facing a gun. But he was banking on one thing. Sporif might want Rodin out of the way, but his overriding concern was for himself. If engaging Rodin might result in his own death, he would step back. Sporif would not pull the trigger unless he was certain of his own victory. I am looking for Ratch. You know that. If I gathered any information from your room, and please note I said, if it was in order to track him down. If that information incriminates yourself in some way, what do I care? Maybe, if I do have such information, we can come to some arrangement when I have fulfilled my current contract. That was good. Appeal to the business side of the man. Give him the chance to make a deal. The gun was lowering, and the hands steadying. Rodin watched this but kept his attention focused on Sporif's face, reading him. His mouth was firm. Usually in a situation like this, Rodin would have expected some twitching words attempting to form, trying to find something to say. His eyes were looking straight at Rodin. No glances to the gun, as if wondering what he was doing. No brief glances to either side, usually a sure sign of the mind working. He was not looking for a way out of the situation. And Rodin suspected he knew why. Sporif was working to a plan. The lowering of the gun was a pretense. Then Sporif nodded.
I don't think much of you, but I trust your word on this.
Rodin doubted that. But he nodded in return. Sporif stepped to one side. The 3 thugs behind copied his lead, leaving a passage for Rodin. He took a step forward, keeping an eye on Sporif. The man held the gun at his side, but Rodin noticed the finger cradling around the trigger. Still ready to fire. Still on alert. He took another step. The 3 thugs were watching him. The wiry one held a grin, matching wide maniacal eyes. The woman's sneer was pure condescension. And the bulky one was impassive, his arms crossed over his chest. Rodin was level with them now. It was impossible to keep an eye on everyone. Already Sporif was at his back. Rodin's senses were on full alert. His ears strained to hear the slightest sound behind him, any indication that Sporif was moving. But the movement didn't come from Sporif. Rodin might have expected him to use the gun, but it made more sense for him to use his thugs. He caught a glimpse of movement to one side. The slightest of nods from the bulky one. Then a shifting shadow to Rodin's right. He turned as the wiry one lunged. Rodin kicked out as he dropped and felt his boot connect with a thud. The wiry one stumbled. Rodin thrust up with the blade already in his hand, forcing it into the man's stomach. He felt blood on his face. He felt weight on his hand as the man fell. He moved and stood, letting the wiry one fall. Then he swung for the next attack. Afterwards, he knew he had been surprised that it was both of them. He had expected the next attack to come from the woman, the bulky one saving himself for last. But in retrospect it made sense, both of them attacking at the same time. It also gave him an advantage. He was in the middle of them. They would not want to go too far, for fear of colliding with their colleague. He stayed where he was, bringing both arms out, a blade in each hand. They rushed, and he saw metal. At the last moment he stepped back and swiped. She was not ready for the move, and he felt his blade slice through her arm. From the force he knew the wound was deep. The bulky one was quicker. Rodin's other blade meant nothing. The man had moved, twisting his body. He now faced Rodin, pushing the woman to one side as she stumbled into him. The blade stabbed forward almost too fast, but Rodin twisted and shifted, feeling the man's arm brush his stomach. As he did so, he brought his own arm down, the blade ready, and sliced deep. Again he felt another person's blood spray. The rest was almost an exercise. Both opponents were wounded. They had both led with their stronger arms and were now struggling. It was almost easy for Rodin to swing round and connect. He stabbed her in the chest, twisting as he did, coming up behind and using his other blade to slice her throat. And he brought the bulky man down with a cut to his leg, before finishing him with a slice across his neck. He turned to the wiry one. Unmoving. But Rodin needed to make sure. A third cut to a neck. Completing the work. He looked up. The whole fight had taken a matter of seconds. He expected to see a gun pointed in his direction. But Sporif had gone. A crash to one side. Rodin turned. The door was swinging shut. With a single breath to compose himself, Rodin followed Sporif.